name's Sandy Starr, and I work at the Progress Educational Trust, which is a charity that works in the fields of genetics and assisted conception and embryo and stem cell research. And I'm the convener of the ethical battles in science and medicine strand that's been taking place in this auditorium throughout the day. The debate we're about to have now is a little bit different. It's called Banning the Brave New World, the Ethics of Science. And what we're going to do is we're going to put away the red and yellow cards from earlier and have a less structured, more open-ended discussion. And the purpose of this is twofold. We're going to try to draw together the themes of the strand, of earlier debates in the strand, and grapple with anything outstanding. So if something's been niggling at you from earlier in the day, that goes for the panel, that goes for the audience, this is your chance to bring it up. The second purpose of this debate is to look at how developments in biomedicine are understood and debated by the general public, and to look at how these developments relate to the broader democratic process, if indeed they do relate to it at all, and how they relate to political and moral deliberation. And we're very lucky to have a fantastic panel here to guide us through these choppy waters. We have Professor David Jones, whom some of you will already have seen speaking this morning at the debate on organ donation and death. David is the director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, which is one of the world's leading bioethics institutes, and he's written, edited and contributed to a number of books on bioethics and philosophy and religion, most recently this one, Chimera's Children, Ethical, Philosophical and Religious Perspectives on Human-Nonhuman Experimentation, a book that could not be more relevant to the debate we're about to have. We then have, on my immediate right, another professor, Professor Robin Lovell-Badge, who's a very eminent scientist who for nearly 20 years now has been head of stem cell biology and developmental genetics at the Medical Research Council's National Institute for Medical Research. He's frequently called upon to provide scientific advice to government and to parliamentary committees, and very significantly for today's discussion, he's a member of both of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority's working groups examining new techniques to avoid the transmission of mitochondrial disease. So last year he was a member of the working group which conducted a scientific assessment of the safety and efficacy of these new techniques, and this year he's a member of the working group that's examining the ethics and the public's understanding of these methods, and that's involved in a public consultation running at this very moment into this issue. A man who understands the issues we're about to discuss in the round. We then have Güneş Taylor, who is a stem cell researcher at the University of Oxford, and she's also been an observer embedded in an IVF clinic in much the same way that journalists are embedded in the military, but probably more frightening than that. We owe Güneş a particular debt of gratitude. It was her who originally came up with the idea for this debate, together with her colleague Richard Swan. Richard's furious he can't be here right now. At this very moment he's chairing a debate about the monarchy on the floor below. That's the battle of ideas for you in a nutshell. And then last but by no means least, we have Ken MacLeod, who has been an invaluable friend to the Battle of Ideas Festival for many years now, and who is an award-winning science fiction author who's written around 14 novels, recently spent a period as writer-in-residence at the Economic and Social Research Council's Genomics Policy and Research Forum, and who's written his latest novel, Intrusion, which has been shortlisted for the Wellcome Trust Book Prize, deservedly so. I very much recommend. An excellent novel in every respect except one. It's bad for your blood pressure. The situations it depicts are liable to make your blood boil. It's been a long day, and there's a lot on the table we can discuss, but I'm going to begin by asking each of you a question on a subject that we're all interested in from one perspective or another in our day jobs, the human embryo. And I'm going to begin with you, David. And I'm going to begin by asking you about the way that embryo research and fertility treatment are regulated in this country. Last year I saw you give a very thought-provoking discussion in which you criticised the Warwick Settlement. For anyone who doesn't know, this is the framework for embryo research and fertility treatment. It emerged from a committee of inquiry chaired by Baroness Mary Warnock in 1984. It's subsequently been promulgated through the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Acts of 1990 and 2008, and David does not like it. David, why is the Warwick Settlement problematic?
Yeah, if you don't mind, if this is unstructured, if I can go back a couple of
by all means,
stages in the thought process. And also, I should say, before I start, that I speak for myself and for no one else, particularly when I'm being provocative, as I will be at the end. I wanted to say...
be provocative now, please.
I wanted to start with something less I hope uncontentious, then move to something slightly more contentious, and then be provocative. So, uncontentious. The subject is called the ethics of science. But I think the proper object of science is actually the true rather than the good. The natural sciences are various disciplines which seek a better understanding of the world. So I don't think, and I don't think there is such a thing as unethical knowledge. So I don't think that we should think of the ethics of science understood as a body of knowledge. But there is the ethics of research, what scientists do in getting to the knowledge, and there is the ethics of application, the ethics of engineering. And both of those things are reasonable to look at the ethics of. So it's not the ethics of science per se, it's the ethics of research or the ethics of application, both of which are reasonable. I think most people would think that these should be ethical endeavours. Second point, a little more contentious. I would suggest that when thinking about the application of technologies, including biotechnologies, in society, there is an analogy between the relationship between the technologist and the public and the relationship between a doctor and a patient. The doctor has his proper area of expertise and, for the most part, has the patient's best interest at heart. But the patient is required to consent before treatment. Why is that? Well, partly because the patient will suffer the consequences, will take the risks, but partly also because the patient has an understanding of the good, what's good for that patient, which might not overlap exactly with the doctor's. The doctor might think they know what's best for the patient, but there is a dialogue to be had between patient and doctor about what is best for the patient, in which the doctor is not a moral expert. And that's the other reason why we need consent. Now, I would say there is an analogy here between the way in which technology should be controlled by democratic process, partly because the public will suffer the consequences or enjoy the consequences, just like a patient, and partly because technologists are not necessarily moral experts in the good. So for similar reasons that we think about consent with the patient, we should think of democratic engagement.
Okay.
Right. Thirdly, quickly, I think that the way in which we actually make decisions in regard to the embryo, that's only one area of biotechnology, but in regard to the embryo is by using the Warnock report, which uses a concept of the special status of the embryo, which in the way that it's employed seems to be about the embryo having a certain status which needs to be protected, and that was given, it has been given by successive governments and parliaments as the reason why we have the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. But if you look at how the HFEA, if you look at how the HFEA actually functions, it doesn't, I would suggest, function to protect the embryo. It actually functions to protect people's feelings who are concerned about the embryo. That's people's feelings like me. And I frankly find that insulting. I would far prefer if the HFEA didn't exist. I would far prefer if those sort of decisions were not made by a body which seems to be representing the embryo but isn't, in a rather dishonest way. And I would say that the problem is it suppresses debate. So even though getting rid of it might make things a bit more libertarian and might make things happen which I don't agree with, I think that it's actually the HFEA as it functions at the moment is a kind of disingenuous charade. Okay. And an insult to participative democracy.
So, Robin, you are on the Horizon Scanning Committee of the HFEA. You've been involved in both these working groups on mitochondrial exchange techniques, and including the one that's currently involved in the public consultation. So, are you a willing part of a disingenuous charade that's an insult to participative democracy?
Ooh. How am I going to answer that one? No. I disagree with lots of things you just said, of course. The HFEA is charged by government to look after this whole area of research and clinical practice. They are also charged by government on occasions to try and understand what the public thinks about these areas of research and clinical practice. And in my view, they take extraordinary lengths to actually distance themselves from the outcome of any public engagement exercise. So, for example, with this whole current thing about mitochondrial transfer, so people will understand that the concept here is that there are some women who carry abnormal mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own little bit of DNA that encodes genes essential for the production of energy in cells. So often these women will have children who are carrying that abnormal mitochondria, so mitochondria only come from the mother, and those children can be suffering from horrible diseases because of the consequence of not having sufficient energy in particular tissues like brain and muscle. And so it's proposed, and there's experiments to suggest that you could get around this by transferring the nuclear genetic material, which has all the genes that encodes our personality traits, etc. You could transfer the nuclear genome from an affected egg with abnormal mitochondria into one that has normal mitochondria that don't carry any genetic problems. And so that's the basis behind this public consultation. And really, what the HFEA were charged to do was, first of all, gather the evidence in terms of the science. We had people on the committee who weren't keen on this. We had people on the committee who were keen on it. We took evidence from a wide range of people from all different views. The current process of the public engagement exercise, which is taking many different forms, including an online consultation, which you should all go and look at and complete. Again, the steering group has a wide range of views on it. So it ranges from people who represent organizations that are helping to look after kids born with these severe mitochondrial diseases, all the way through to Josephine Quintavalli, for example, who is Catholic and is pro-life. So it has a wide range of views, and the way we work on this committee is to try and make sure that all the information that's going out there for the public consultation is as neutral as possible. So I have agreed on many occasions with Josephine Quintavallis, you'll be interested to know, on some aspects, because I felt that the information that was going to go out was not neutral. So
okay,
we'll make that happen.
Okay, that raises a number of interesting questions, which I'll park for a moment, because I'd like to turn to you, Güneş. I know from talking to you, you have a particular interest in the possibilities for in vitro derived gametes, sperm or eggs that are made in the laboratory and that are made from stem cells, which might come originally from our skin rather than from our genitals. Could you explain for us, before we go any deeper, what this means, what it entails?
Okay, yeah, I'll do my best. Essentially, you might have heard some of this over the course of today's strand. Basically, when an embryo is first formed, it is a single cell made of the oocyte and the sperm fused together. And as time passes, it splits into multiple cells, and then eventually these cells start deciding to go down particular lineages, as it's called. So they become different sort of layers originally, a bit like how gravy settles with the fat on top and the bits in between and that kind of thing. And then from there they go on to sort of the middle bit will contain your organs, for example, or the outer bit will become your skin. And we discussed epigenetics in one of our sort of debates earlier today. And epigenetics is the way that the genome, which is the sort of collection of all the genes that every single cell in your body contains, well, nearly every single cell in your body anyway, has exactly the same set of instructions. So it's the equivalent of having everyone having the highway code at home. But how you interpret it sort of comes down to your reading of that. And how that reading is done is epigenetic modification. And so there's this increase, recently anyway, over the last 20, 30, 40, whatever years, to find out how cells go down these particular lineages. And the idea is, if you know how it goes one way, then you can strongly encourage cells to go in the other direction. So the thought is, I could take, if something happened to me and I was unable to have children in the future, but we'd learnt sufficient about regulation and chromatin and epigenetics, all these long complicated words which basically mean why does a cell that originally is just one cell become all these amazing cells that do lots of different kinds of things. And then we could put it in a dish, throw things at it that makes it sort of essentially forget that it was a skin cell or a toe cell or whatever it is, and revert back to its original unmarked, unsullied state, i.e. back to what I would have been like as a single-celled embryo in my mother. And then, if you know how to push it in the opposite direction, you'd know how to push it back down the way you want it to. And so we would then be able to sort of provide signals to make it become, in my case, an oocyte, or in a man's case, obviously, a sperm. And the idea is to, if you could do that, if we could do that, I would be able to have children at any point in my life. In fact, if someone took my skin cells and I died and decided later on that maybe I should have had children or something, then that could also be done. And it sort of raises an interesting situation where anyone of any age, in any condition, can have children. And so, yeah, that was...
I know of several examples, a lot of them in Israel, of people being conceived with the stored sperm of the deceased. It's quite a contentious legal area, and I can just imagine the floodgates if in vitro derived gametes become possible. But I'm going to ask you one more question, Güneş, which is, I'm very excited for what you just described. I love the idea, the human reproductive cycle moving outside the body, fantastic, bring it on. Now, let's say, and there have been various attempts to do this, and I don't think they've yet well, eggs is very complicated. But they've not succeeded in creating viable human sperm that could even fertilise an egg, much less have all the epigenetics taken on board to result in a functioning and a healthy person. Let's say that they do, the thought experiment. It's actually Robin who usually is called upon to pour water on the claims that it's been done, because he knows his onions figuratively and biologically. But
onions not biological.
I imagine you know a bit about onions either way. Okay, so we do this. We create a viable in vitro derived human sperm or eggs. Robin says it's really been done. They're not making up this time. A committee like the one he did with the HFEA says it's safe, it's efficient. Should we do it? How do we decide? Should we do what's being done with the mitochondria, get the HFEA to run a public consultation? Do we put it to a referendum or a vote? What do you think should happen?
I am of the opinion that a public consultation would actually be a good thing. I think a leap like that would fundamentally change what we as humans and humankind and mankind are doing on the face of this planet, how long we're going to last, and how we will have essentially taken evolution into our hands, because that is it. That is the ultimate thing that we can do. Nature no longer will decide when we reproduce, and our bodies are now no longer slaves to the germline, this you must reproduce at some point to propagate your genes. We have the ability to pause like a Virgin TV box thing and just rewind and go back and reinstate and all that kind of thing. And so I think it would be very essential to talk to everybody, and call me an idealist, but I think it's entirely...
So we'll come to the subject of what happens when some people aren't happy about it. Do you ignore them? What do you do? Do you say tough? I mean, at this point, it's a good time to bring in Ken and his novel Intrusion. For those of you who don't know, I think this is a depiction on the cover of one. There are many interesting aspects of this book we could discuss, but one of the main aspects of the plot is this pill called the Fix. And in the world of this novel, pregnant women are all but compelled early in pregnancy to take this pill. And through a series of subtle but thoroughgoing genetic and epigenetic modifications, it removes many of the things that would adversely affect the health of the resulting child. So it results in healthy children, or children that don't have health problems they might otherwise have had. And we can talk about that, but what interests me is what happens in the novel to those who do not want to take this. And what happens is that I'll actually let you discuss it, Ken, and I'm also interested in how this relates to the present day, how you extrapolate it, if indeed you did, from our current circumstances. What happens to those who don't want to take the Fix?
Yeah, well, the way I set it up as a thought experiment was to make sure that no animals or embryos were harmed in the thought experiment. So I set it up as entirely based on synthetic biology. The Fix is a pill or a device, if you like, that makes use of no animal or human tissue. And I could have given some hand-waving about epigenetics and so forth if I had been more ruthless
You're being too
about
modest,
it.
you did.
Yeah, I did I? Oh, good. The reason why it becomes contentious in the story is that what I tried to do was to bracket off the obvious religious objections and to say, for the sake of the story, that the major religions had no problems with it, but that some of the minor religions did. And although it's not compulsory, there's pressure to take it on the pregnant woman. And the exemptions, there are exemptions built in to the law that makes it, permits it. And initially, these exemptions were put in to protect the doctors, so that the doctors would not be sued if they allowed a woman to decline, because she had these conscientious objections. And as the pressure builds to make it effectively compulsory, to say that for a woman not to take this pill, to take the fix, is harming the interests of her future child, yeah, that's where it becomes a matter of public interest, then these exemptions still allow a get-out, a conscience clause. But the heroine and protagonist of the novel refuses to pretend to have any religious beliefs that she doesn't have. She also refuses to have any moral ideologies that she doesn't have, because she doesn't know what the basis of her objection is. She just doesn't want it. And in that sense, it's a deeply reactionary and irrational book, and a deeply irrational and reactionary stance that she takes. And in some ways, I don't sympathize with her. I would, metaphorically speaking, have given her, if she was a friend of mine, I would have sort of given her a good shake and said, come on now, be sensible. But being her creator, I obviously can't do that. I can only follow through the logic of what she's thinking, and I find myself very sympathetic to her, and I wanted the reader to be sympathetic to her. And I think in some ways what it's about is the issues not so much of bioethics as of the rights of individuals to make a choice without having to justify them, or without having to come up with an improved justification, especially not from a justification from a menu of approved choices. You know, oh, I'm a sedevacantist, I'm a Moravian Baptist or whatever, and therefore I can legitimately object. Or I'm a green eco-freak and a goddess worshipper or whatever, and therefore I can object. No, we have to be able to object to things simply because we do, on the basis of our own free will, as we were discussing on one of the earlier panels, not on this strand. And I think the reasons where I projected it from was not so much from existing and available technology, although that had some effect, because I was fascinated by the possibilities of synthetic biology, but from the ways in which you can see now how as soon as a woman becomes pregnant, she becomes public property, she becomes an object of public concern, she becomes a potential site of intervention. Well-meant intervention, of course, often ones that are unobjectionable kinds of intervention, but nevertheless, they have to be seen as such, and considered and not simply taken for granted. And secondly, the increasing extent to which what should be moral decisions and moral arguments are replaced by medical arguments, or rather that the medical moral issue of health becomes the overriding factor in moral arguments, and it trumps everything else, notably the freedom of individuals. And we see this often in very small things that are individually trivial, like restrictions on sugar and salt, let alone things like the smoking ban. And if you object to the fact that KP nuts are more or less mandated to put less salt on their peanuts, and you can't have the good old hit of a good smack of salted peanut in your mouth when you particularly want a salty peanut, you're a crank. Okay, I'm a crank, I admit it. But I do object to that. And it's the endless accumulation of tiny things like that gives rise to a world that's regulated without any rationale other than this medicine trumping morality rationale.
No, that's admirably clear. So we have a number of different perspectives on the table about the relationship between science and medicine and what we choose and want and tolerate collectively and individually. I can think of many directions I'd like to develop that in, but I will bring the audience in a second and encourage you to ask whatever you want. And I did mean it when I said pull things from earlier in the day. So we don't just have to talk about the embryo. If you want to relate it to healthy eating, to the whole epigenetic concept of don't harm your child or your grandchildren's health, or anything else that's been discussed today, please do. Does anyone want to pitch in at this stage from the floor with a question or comment? Oh, very good.
Just sort of jumping back to the debate we had, I think the previous one on sort of evidence-based policy type areas, I think that's an interesting phrase that's used because it's obviously based on evidence-based medicine, but it lacks the thing in medicine, which is we have a body of natural scientific knowledge about how the human body works, but the patient can consent or not to whatever treatment. Whereas in evidence-based policy, it's we know about politics, so shut up, basically. Here's the policy ideas that we have, and we have done some studies and we know what we're doing, and it's an attempt to remove consent and democracy from it. So just, kind of reasserting that aspect, which is central to medicine, that is trying to be denied in politics currently. So, just throwing that in.
What is the difference between morality and ethics, if there is one, and what are we to make of the growth of ethics over the last few decades? Because my concern is that, certainly in the way in which it's practiced at the moment, ethics seems to embody an expert view, and an expert view that can then be imposed on the morality of others. So, for example, and sometimes in quite subtle ways, I'm very struck in IVF, for example, we've removed donor anonymity, and there's now a big push to say, for the psychological welfare of the child, parents need to be counselled that they must tell their children how they were conceived. And so they receive counselling. And often in these spheres, counselling becomes a next step from some of the ethical questions in which people are encouraged to make a certain decision, which perhaps may go against their own instinctive morality.
In Ken's book, there's a theory of is it the free social market?
The free and social market.
The free and social market is a model whereby you make decisions on people's behalf that they would have made had they been in possession of all the correct information. Or as it's otherwise known nowadays, informed choice. Very interesting concept. Anyway, please, sir.
Yes, I'm Roger Junior Cirola. I was on the previous panel. I also do research on moral emotions, including, most prominently, moral disgust and anger. Therefore, I was intrigued by the sentence in the abstract of this panel, substantive moral objections being condescendingly dismissed as the irrational yuck reaction. And I would like maybe some of you to expand on that, just bearing in mind that there are some views of morality that say morality is based on emotions, and if you don't have the yuck, the grr, the awe reaction, then you don't have much of morality at all.
There's a short essay by George Orwell called The Prevention of Literature, and Ken's presence on the panel as a writer made me think of it. And the point Orwell makes in that essay is that a writer can't survive in a totalitarian state. An artist can't survive in a totalitarian state. And that's because the project of imagining and saying something about the human world requires the freedom of the author to make that happen, to bring that something into the world. He then goes on to contrast the freedom necessary for an artist or a writer with the ability of scientists to get along relatively happy without being in a free society. Because, and I might push your argument slightly further, David, I don't think science is to do with the truth. It's certainly not to do with the good. It's certainly not to do with the truth either. I think it's in the business of constructing verifiable hypotheses about the material world, but that's not a matter of the truth, right? And that's why scientists in a totalitarian society can operate testing hypotheses such as, does 2 + 2 = 5? Now, the reason I bring that up is to pose the question, and I don't think David's question's really been answered where we started, which is the use of consultations and expertise and so on to massage and regulate the public. Doesn't this problem only come up for us, asking about the morality of it, because of a relative disconnect of people in engaging themselves in a free society? I.e., are we asking this question, what can we get over on the people and what can we not? What might they object to and what might they not? From a kind of up here point of view, how much science can I get down them today? What can we get away with? In a way, it's sort of the question. How do we manage the public?
Okay.
It's only because we've already taken the view that the public are something of a problem. So are we asking these questions about moral regulation? Simply, is it an index of lack of freedom?
I'll start with you, Robin, and I'm going to put you on the spot and have you respond to the biologist in stem cell biology, respond to the philosophically discursive point that's just been made. But in Robin's defence, before I put you on the spot, I will say, like David, like others in the audience, I am sceptical about the consultation exercise and its role in democracy. But of all the scientists I know, Robin is the one who is always up for telling it to the public as it is. And every time someone else comes on board and goes, oh, they won't, well, they like that, or, you know, he goes, no, you've got to tell it as it is. However, these consultations are problematic. This whole scenario is problematic, or is it?
I think it's very good that people challenge the whole idea about it, actually, because I think you're not going to get a buy-in if people are suspicious of a consultation.
Okay.
So, I mean, if politically, I have no idea what the Minister of Health is going to decide at the end of this consultation. But he's going to be presented all sorts of evidence from different sources. So the science, Nuffield Bioethics Council, who did a pure ethics analysis, they're going to have the results of this public consultation, which has been done in various ways, but the idea being to provide information so that people can, based on the information they're given, which varies in quantity according to the different approaches that have been taken, can come up with a view as to whether this should be allowed to take place clinically rather than just for research purposes, which is currently going on. And so I'm going to lose the track where I'm going now. It's not, and he's also going to take probably account of political and other issues.
Okay, let me ask you something.
Another problem.
Let me ask you something, though. What does that mean for the Secretary of State for Health to take account of your views, possibly mine, possibly David, those of Josephine Quintavalli? I mean, it seems, certainly my views, and probably yours, I imagine, and those of Josephine and those of David, are implacably, intractably opposed. What does it mean to take account of them all and come to a decision? Does that actually mean anything?
The reason why I think it's important to do this is so that the public understand what's happening and what it's about, in a way that, you can take another completely different example of genetically modified crops. That, as far as I'm concerned, was a complete disaster. As a scientist, was a complete disaster because there was no attempt at proper involving the public in a decision by giving them information first. So they were faced with companies doing things which none of us were happy about, and on the basis of that, the political decision was, no, we don't do that. We don't go there at all. And I think not going through this exercise is a mistake. We go through this exercise because the more everyone knows about at least aspects of the technology, the more they're likely to appreciate when or not it should be used. And this is important, I think, for the Secretary of Health to come to a decision about whether or not it should be allowed and how it is going to be regulated. So it's providing information that decides how something is going to be regulated. He doesn't, he can just say yes in these circumstances with the appropriate consent, it can go ahead.
Right.
He doesn't have to say yes or no.
Okay. I'm going to turn to you, David. There's a lot of things you can respond to. You can respond to what Robin's just said. You can respond to the charge that, science isn't about truth. I mean, you know, a lot of us sympathise with what you've said about the HFEA. Certainly, I don't think any quango has accountability commensurate with its power and so on. But let me defend it a little bit as well. I mean, if there weren't this haven of the Warwick Settlement, if the moral state of the embryo was the subject of continuing political contestation in the Department of Health on the floor of the House of Commons, I mean, nothing could proceed. You would not have taken a definitive decision whereby there could be organised fertility treatment and embryo research in any consistent way. Would you not then just have a presumption in the opposite direction of that things can't proceed because things keep impeding them?
No, well, I'm sure within the political settlement that we have in this country, they would proceed. I mean, I think that in general with consultations, and people should think back to various consultations they might have known or been interested in on a wide variety of subjects, on nuclear power or on motorways or on runways or on... when you have a public consultation, it seems to me that there's typically two sorts broadly. That where a decision has not yet been taken and where people's views are taken because there is real perplexity and people are actually involved with a decision which hasn't actually been taken. And I've known this. I mean, I'm not universally cynical about consultations. Sometimes the people who have to make the decision are a bit perplexed themselves, and they want to be sure which way to go. And there are other consultations which are essentially public relations exercise where people know what they want. They're very clear what they want, but they want to get the public on side. That's called informing the public, and before they have their view. And we've all known. I mean, I'd be surprised if there is nobody here who can think of a consultation like this. I would say, with regard to this present consultation on mitochondrial transfer, that it was announced by the Secretary of State on the same day that the Wellcome Trust announced that they would actually fund it, and on the same day as the Nuffield Council announced that they were going to have this consultation. Now, I think that without any casting any aspersions about the Wellcome Trust or any aspersions about the Nuffield Council, I think from the Secretary of State's point of view, I would be absolutely amazed. I mean, I would bet a large amount of money against him coming out against this. It just runs so counter to so many things. To me, this is a consultation where the government have clear views about what they want. Now, and also, I think that I have scepticism about the HFEA in general as a body to take this, but I think there are different kinds of consultation, and I think you can sometimes tell. And I would say make your own mind up about this, but look at some of the characters involved about setting it up in the first place.
Well, I only wish things were that organised. I'm very flattered by David's alluding to some of my colleagues, and I only wish we had the wherewithal to be as conspiratorial. We might do rather better if we were. I'll turn to you, Ken. You can respond to whatever you like, but you've done a fantastic thought experiment. Like you know, I'm sympathetic with the protagonist in some ways, not in others. How does this relate to vaccination? Should people be compelled to take this thing? So, fantastic thought experiment. When it comes to this question of how in political life, whether and how we consult the public on far-reaching therapies and breakthroughs, do you have any thoughts on how it should be done or what anyone else has said?
I think I would agree with David on the importance of consulting the public. I do, however, there are two points here. One is that I think if we examine his analogy of the doctor-patient relationship with the technologist-public relationship, I don't quite think that democratic consultation works in the same way. Obviously, you're a philosopher, you're well aware of this, and as the same way as individual consent. No. And it makes it an intrinsically more problematic process. The other one is that, according to the social scientists that I was embedded with, as it were, I was a sort of embedded writer, in the same way as Güneş is an embedded clinic. Yeah. That often the more the public knows about it, in the case of GM, what happened was that the public was consulted and was informed, and what they found was that the better informed people were about GM, the more they were opposed to it. And when they did set up travelling roadshows and so on to promote GM and explain it to the baffled, ignorant, suspicious public, and the more they explained it, the more suspicious and baffled and hostile the public got.
Which raises an interesting question. At what point, if at all, the people who make these decisions should say, stuff the public, we're going this way? Güneş, I mean, we were talking before, you spoke poetically about the far-reaching consequences of in vitro-derived gametes, Promethean flame, and all that. How are we going to decide whether or not to proceed? We'll get the HFEA to run a consultation. I mean, is it not of greater world historical importance than that? I think back to IVF, and an amazing leap was taken with IVF. There comes a certain point, no matter how much scientific evidence you've got, I'm sure everyone will back me up, where you take a leap of faith with things that have ramifications for future generations. You never eliminate all the risks. At a certain point, you take a leap of faith. With IVF, that decision was made. Very contentious at the time. It's hard. But anyway, do you really think that there's a mechanism whereby the public can be meaningfully involved before taking a decision as far-reaching as removing the reproductive cycle from the human body?
Well, I think before everyone else started talking, I would have said yes, but now I'm feeling a bit more cynical. I just think it has to be done. You can't not, really. I mean, if we're going to say that the HFEA doesn't do the job, and then something else has to be found, because you can't make such a big, important decision about humanity just by, you know what, we'll just do it and see what happens. I mean, if no one's willing to take the bull by the horns, I can see that happening at some point, because in the end, things like that will just get done, I believe.
Okay.
And that's why people have started making these sorts of legislative blockades, or whatever you want to call them, or why we're even talking about it, because it's becoming increasingly a potential reality, and people are aware of the fact that, well, whether we talk about it now or we don't, at some point someone's going to turn around and say, well, guess what, guys, we're ready. We've done it in mice, we've done it in chimpanzees, we've done it in horses, we've done it in everything else. All that's left is humans. How about it? So I'm not going to profess to have an answer, because, again, like I said, I'm a bit of an idealist. I'm the kind of person who would sit down and get a commission and say, let's go out, let's talk to people, let's see what they think.
I mean, would you take no for an answer? People don't want it. So you go, okay, they don't want it.
Okay, so maybe not a consultation then, maybe a dialogue.
Oh, do you work for the HFEA?
Maybe I will.
You will soon. Okay, I'm going to go back out to the audience again.
Can somebody just quickly explain on this very piece of technology, what is the yuck? What should we be nervous about?
I spent all day saying, we must trust the public, and they're smart, and they can do this, they can understand stuff. And now I'm sat here thinking, well, wait, what's wrong with this idea? And I'm thinking about going home and talking to my mum about total brain failure, and how, in the event of me being in a coma, if I've got total brain failure, then it's okay to take out my heart. But if it's anything less than that, okay, Mum, then don't let them take out my heart. And I don't think my mum's going to get it. I just have, I have a slight nagging suspicion that this is not quite going to connect with her. And it's not because she's stupid, as it happens. I mean, it's just because she's not engaged in these kinds of discussions, not engaged in these debates, not politically engaged, socially engaged. I mean, she's kind of disengaged. And a lot of the public seem to be like that. It's like we don't live in a very political period. We don't live in a period where we're discussing very much at all. We're really weird coming to the Battle of Ideas every year and doing this. We're not normal. And so I'm wondering who are the people that we're talking to in these consultations. I'm guessing they're not really very normal as well. And then I'm wondering how it is that we basically do this properly. And this just doesn't seem like we're doing it properly.
I've just got an impression with these gametes outside the body. There's a sense of you doing it because you can. And I'm just thinking, why would you want to, I mean, I can understand women having chemotherapy, but one can remove the eggs in advance. Similarly, sperm can be stored already. I mean, you say, well, it has been done in mouse, yes, and development has gone on for a certain distance with artificial gametes. But I just don't understand. They can do it in mouse, and then they do it in horses, and of course we'll do it in humans. But why? Because you can? That worries me. I wanted to say something about, I did go to the cow embryo, the cow-human hybrid.
Admixed embryos.
Consultation.
Yeah.
And I felt very strongly that the audience was being manipulated for the heifer to achieve a certain outcome, that would be accepted. I felt very much against it and felt very cross that we were being manipulated.
I'll come back
to that.
That
was just my feeling, my personal feeling, and it may not have been what was happening.
If you were to ask a question in different countries, you probably get different answers. So let's say the go out to consultation, the answer is negative, but Switzerland says you can. Does that mean you emigrate to Switzerland and do your work there because that's where you can? Yeah. In the same way, if you've got a grandfather who's really terminally ill, you go to Switzerland, you go to Dignitas, and so on.
Good question. Can we hop back a few rows? Yes.
This is kind of Marilyn's point as well, because during the GM debate, I really did feel manipulated, ironically, because the debate was framed in scientific terms, when for me it was actually political. I was far less worried about the science of the crops than I was the consequence of sterile crops on farmers and the effects of monopoly capitalism. So my immediate reaction is no to most GM crops, but I have celiac. Somebody wants to genetically engineer gluten-free wheat, and I'm right there.
Yeah.
I sort of agree with a lot of the points that were made about the consultation and how you go about. I think, forgive my ignorance, but until a few months ago, I had no idea of who the HFEA were and what they did. And I'm 19, and I'm probably within a very, very small percentage of 19-year-olds who know who the HFEA are, yet the sort of decisions that you're making are going to affect my generation and the generation younger. And also I've got a question about selecting for disabilities in embryos and what your sort of stances are on that. And
very interesting question.
Just how do you go about engaging the proper members of the public? Because I know in exactly the same way as the gentleman Stuart, as it said earlier about speaking to his mum, I can have entire conversations with my family at the moment about things that they just stare blankly at me and go, yes, Catherine. So how do you engage the rest of society in things that are important but they don't necessarily realise affect them in different ways?
What do you think about, on the democracy point, what do you think about the often chilling and anti-progressive effect that the attempt to democratize science has on the scientific discourse? I mean, we've seen this with the drugs debate, for example, where people's religious and often obscene personal motivations are allowed to affect public policy instead of the pure, brutal science.
Okay. I'm going to ask the panel, I'm so sorry anyone who's not been taken, we're going to go and have a drink after this, we're going to continue it informally. Cherry pick what you'd like to respond to, including from your fellow panellists in the audience, and give us your concluding thought for the day. I'll start with you, Güneş.
Okay, so why do it? I mean, why do we have doctors? Why do we have medicine? Because we're not happy with being unwell? Or why do we fund research into debilitating disease? Because we don't wish to be unwell. We want to fix it. We want to get rid of it. There's no one on earth who would ever say, what I'm really looking forward to is turning, 65 and developing dementia at some, obscenely young age or something like that. So why would we not use all the information that we have to be able to better humanity, essentially? And I think if we were able to create gametes outside of the body in a dish or whatever, put them back into the human after fertilization, or even just create them, the stem cells in a dish and put them into a human, and it would seem almost like it was completely normal. Why would we not use that? Because people suffer, because people lose the ability to have children, because there's this whole dichotomy between germline and soma, where the germline is the thing that must continue and the soma is the disposable part. So humankind is, the whole evolution thing is we've been pushed through evolution because the genes have got to survive, etc., etc. Now we have medicine, so we look after people who are unwell. And just one thing about the engagement point that was made, I think the thing about the germline or reproduction is pretty much anybody will have an opinion on that. If you said to them, well, you don't need to worry about it, As a woman who, in science, for example, I have to consider the fact that if I push my career too hard, I might miss my window of opportunity and find myself, struggling away in the IVF clinics where I've worked to have my own children. I mean, these are things that will liberate and free, and yeah, I think it's a positive thing.
So we have someone who thinks it's incumbent on their opponent to say, why should we do this? And one who says it's incumbent to say, why shouldn't you? Which is very interesting. Robin wants to come in here. Can you combine it with summing up, Robin? I know it's a tall order.
Oh, gosh. Lots of points to make. One reason why germ cells in vitro, well, there's actually several, there's lots. And this relates to something that you said earlier. The ability to make gametes in vitro is incredibly important for research into contraception, genetic abnormalities, fertility. All those things it's important for, so doing this is sort of ethics-free, the ability to be able to do it. Whether you then license it for fertility treatment, that's when you have the ethics issues, and there are reasons for doing that for young girls or young boys, pre-puberty. You will want to do it because there's no way of preserving their sperm or eggs at the moment. There are people who may have been subject to some environmental insult which has led to the destruction of their germ cells. I don't know, Chernobyl. I mean, who knows? There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to do it. I was asked about what was the yuck factor to do with the mitochondrial transfer thing. Well, I don't think in terms of just, I think it's my personal view is that faced with the choice of having a child born with a severe disease or doing this procedure, I think it's, you should go ahead with it. However, this is a form of germline genetic engineering, and that's the issue that needs to be out there in the public and the public to think about, because a lot of people are going to have an instant reaction against doing this type of procedure. It is completely different, the procedures, the techniques used, and that's why, again, it's important to let everyone know what's the technology being used. So any technology can be used for good or bad. Fire can be used to cook meals or burn people. You've got to understand the technology to be able to regulate it correctly. The technology used to do the mitochondrial swapping is completely different from the sorts of technology that you would use to manipulate genes in the genome. And so understanding the methodology is really important. So people should be less scared if they understand the methods used for mitochondrial disease, that we're ever going to go down the route of germline genetic engineering of genes within the nucleus. I agree with the comment there about the HFEA's public consultation on the human-animal thing. It wasn't done well, but we've learned from that because it wasn't done well. And so I think currently the way that things are being done is getting much, much better. Gluten-free wheat. That's a perfect example of why one reason why you have a public consultation, because members of the public come up with ideas. They say, well, hey, if you were to do this, I'm all for it. So it's trawling for ideas beyond those, people wearing white coats, scientists like me, ethicists, politicians. You get members of the public coming up with interesting, good ideas. So that's one reason why everyone should be involved.
Thank you, Robin. Well, David, you impugned the independence of these institutions.
Well, let's see what the result is. But I think that there are various forces in this country. I think with regard to germline genetic engineering, for me, it's also a question of eugenics. It's also a question of selecting genetic features for the future. I think that we have a kind of double history in this country of eugenics. With the first, it was a term invented by an Englishman, and the first conference was in England, and we were very strongly in favour of eugenics, but we didn't actually go through some of down the path of sterilisation that other countries did. Partly because we also had people who are very strongly opposed to it, and we also have movements and the disability rights movement, which is also very strong in this country, and we have different kinds of cultural forces. I understand why people are concerned about ethics being hijacked by one group or another group, and about the suspicion of ethical expertise. I think ethical expertise is a very problematic notion. I think that it's much better to think of the non-expertise in ethics as sort of shared non-expertise. What's the difference between ethics and morals? Morals is just ethics in Latin, and ethics is just morals in Greek. So ethos, mores. It's the same. It is the same. It comes from the same root, and the same root because it's concerned with the right human behaviour, and concern with right human behaviour can both be a good thing to protect people, and it can also be a bad thing to restrict people. And I think it's right, whatever you call it, whether you call it morals or you call it ethics, it's good to think of how the word is being used and to broaden the number of people who are bringing their human experience to it.
I mean it as a compliment when I say, David, that I consider you a philosopher, not an ethicist. Ken, can you conclude?
Yeah, when Güneş was talking about what will happen if these new procedures or developments are unconscionably delayed, that somebody will come up and say, we've done it in mice, we've done it in rats, we've done it in chimps, and we've done it in horses. I thought you was about to finish by saying, and now they're doing it in Korea. Because I think that's the answer to the gentleman at the back who raised the question about the stultifying effect of democracy on scientific development. And I think that's a genuine issue. When I was recently asked to draft a comic about stem cells, explaining really why we have the arguments about them and how we conduct them and so on. And I did it in a very moderate, open-minded and balanced style, I hope. But that's what I was aiming for, and it got sort of vetted by various people smarter and more knowledgeable than I am, and all came through all right. But when I was doing the research for it, we are allowed to speak with one of the real prominent scientists and physicians, a pioneer in applying stem cell therapies. And after he had told us the trials and tribulations that he has gone through as a result of regulation mindlessly applied on a European scale, the horrendous delay and expense, and the horrendous human cost for many individuals that he could have treated but aren't. What I was actually burning to write was a libertarian rant, which of course I didn't. But someday I will write that libertarian rant. And I think in the meantime, the fact that there is international competition does kind of bring us back to reality on this issue. We can consult in this country, but somebody's going to go ahead and do it in China.
Okay. We have a big round of applause for our speakers.